here. We're beginning political ethics, and I'm going to start tonight with, we start with the fact, of course. Everybody knows that there is such a thing as political society. Every nation has one. But the interesting question arises as to where do they come from? What are they based on? Where do they get their authority? And curiously, we're not going to begin tonight with the study of natural law, but rather we're going to take a look at some of the proponents of social contract theory, because it has had such a profound impact upon modern states, modern society, and it is really the alternative to the natural law explanation. And to that end, we're going to start by examining Thomas Hobbes, who was an English political philosopher, born in 1588, died in 1679. His major work was called the Leviathan, which was published in 1651 and laid down the basic concept for what we call social contract theory. One has to understand that Hobbes was born in 1588. He said that this was the same time, incidentally. I guess he was born prematurely because of the threat of the oncoming Spanish Armada. And of course, he was in England, which was at risk. Didn't turn out that way, but was at risk from the Armada. So his life began in a context of fear. And that had a great deal of influence on the political philosophy which he developed, also because he was alive during the English Civil War. The English Civil War ran between 1642 and 1651, and the last king, Charles I, was executed in 1649, and Charles II, his son, was restored to the throne in 1661. And during the period of the English Civil War, for about 19 years, we had Oliver Cromwell most of the time, and then his son Richard Cromwell temporarily, creating a rather unsettled civil society, one in which one's life was very much at risk, and this was a matter of grave concern to Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes was very much concerned about the instability of society, and he gave great thought to what it was like if you have no civil government which is stable. And he viewed the life of man, therefore, as being short, nasty, solitary, and brutish. That is, when men are living without some kind of civil society, he says, each man is a wolf unto other men. Each person is in a constant state of war. Now, you have to understand that his philosophy was such that he viewed the laws of physics as describing the movement of everything, including human organisms, including, it appears, even God, heaven, and hell. Now, you might wonder what kind of a peculiar philosophy of religion this would be. He was suspected of being a bit of an atheist, but he insisted that he did believe in God. The problem, of course, we have is if I say I believe in God, but my God is this podium up here, does that make me a theist or an atheist? What it really means is I believe in podiums. And as far as Hobbes' conception of God, he may have believed in God, but his God was apparently a physical God. So he probably did qualify for the status of being a kind of atheist. In any event, he viewed the individual humans as not being that unlike some kind of an advanced ape, and acting very much on his own basis of defense, so that left unto ourselves, we really had a completely unstable situation. He said, really, there's no law in that context because there's no common power to enforce it. So even though he may have believed in God, one of the things you have to understand here is that a lot of people will say they admit God, and they may even have a very correct theology of God, or I should say of metaphysics of God, but at the same time they often divorce the world from God to such an extent that they really aren't perceiving the world the way that it is. We even have this today, I would say, on the part of some theistic evolutionists who one would think to be Christian, indeed even Catholic. I'm thinking of one offhand who really, and he typifies a lot of people, would say that the world operates according to the basic laws of physics, and that, and I've mentioned this to you before, at the level of the things we see around us, the macroscopic level, all the laws that we learn in metaphysics obtain. But when you get down to the submicroscopic level, laws like causality don't operate that way. All that you have is probability. And this sounds well and good, but what happens is you get a twist in your philosophy as a result. Some of these people would say, well, that's where you get free will, because of the uncertainty of what's happening at that submicroscopic level. Or others would say, as this person I'm thinking of, I don't really want to name him, would argue that at the submicroscopic level, there's a certain degree of unpredictability. This follows from Heisenberg, of course, and the Copenhagen School of Physics. The problem with this sounds well and good. Sometimes they use it as a means of divorcing the world from God by avoiding the problem of evil, by saying, well, you know, God made the world, but he's not responsible because ultimately at the submicroscopic level it operates by quantum mechanics, and heavens, nobody knows what comes out of that. So God isn't really responsible. But here's the problem. What happens to divine providence? What happens to the doctrine that God knows everything? What happens to the notion that God foresees and oversees everything that happens in the created world? Now, I'm sure that many of these people don't want to undercut that, but they may not understand that by putting an inherent degree of unpredictability and unknowability at the very basis of physics, what you've done is to rip part of reality out of divine providence. And as far as saying that the human free will, some materialists would say this, that the human free will comes from the basic unpredictability of the subatomic world, well, what kind of freedom is that? That's nothing but chance. That means whether you choose to be a good person or an evil person is pure luck. So what happens to your responsibility? What I'm really trying to get at here is we have to be concerned about having a completely integrated philosophy from the top to the bottom. You can't just say, as the deists do, God made the world and it goes running off on its own. However, you know, he set it up beautifully according to nature and it just runs automatically. He doesn't have anything further to do with it. You get varying degrees of distancing God from the world. Some, the absolute deist just has him, you know, he starts the whole thing and walks away. Others, like the one I was just describing, would by and large say God has providence over things, but then they rip away the foundation of providence by denying the metaphysical principles operate at the subatomic level. This basically was what I was getting from Dr. de Koning. Ultimately, because following the Copenhagen school, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle applies at the subatomic level, so there are no universal metaphysical laws at the subatomic level. That's what leads many modern physicists to deny the principle of non-contradiction applies at the subatomic level. But then they will say on a stochastic basis, at the macroscopic level, the laws all work. But of course, ultimately, do they? Or are you just saying, well, the odds are just so hugely in favor of them working that you can presume they do? See, this is not metaphysics. This is just probabilism. But the world doesn't exist by probabilities. A thing either is or it isn't. It either has being or it doesn't have being. And if it has being, no matter how tiny it is, God has to know it. Otherwise, he is not omniscient. You see, in other words, you can't toy with the fringes of metaphysics or the fringes of physics and not keep them all integrated completely with God without destroying God or destroying a proper concept of God in the process. And so we have Thomas Hobbes here really saying, well, maybe there's a God, but the world is operating completely independent of him. We're a bunch of nasty little animals left unto ourselves, and the only reason we form society is to protect ourselves from ourselves. Well, that's not a very noble conception of society. Think about it. He says we act like little atoms, as it were, repulsed by competition, greed, and glory. These are the causes, he says, of quarrel. Glad you made it. So, the human condition is not a very good condition. The law of nature, just left to itself, is based on having a kind of liberty. The extent of this liberty is basically you can do anything you want to do, except, of course, that you may infringe on others and they may shoot you. So remember, Hobbes is operating in the context of the English Civil War, where you could get shot. And he's thinking this is a very horrible kind of circumstance. So we have to have some kind of remedy to it. And he says that it's kind of a natural law that we seek peace, not because we're nice, not because we're not selfish, but we seek peace because we're trying to preserve our existence at any cost. Doesn't matter what it is. There's nothing natural about this. I mean, in the sense of something that God ordained. This is a matter of the struggle for survival at its worst. And the only reason that we enter into a social contract to establish some kind of government is so that we don't kill each other, basically, or rape and pillage and steal and otherwise dishonor our neighbor. So, to ensure our continued existence, rational man enters into a contract, again I'm talking Hobbes, enters into a contract with others and forfeits all authority over himself to a sovereign. Now that sovereign could be anything. It could be a king, it could be a parliament. Remember, this is during the English Civil War, so that was the alternatives, a king or a parliament, a king or an assembly, to be exact. And so you create a sovereign that has absolute authority over everything. You surrender your authority to this sovereign, which he calls the Leviathan. It's kind of a human-composed monster. fact, in the preface to the first edition of the Leviathan, it's got a template that shows this monster rising up. Just from the waist up, you see him with a crown on top and all kinds of images of little human figures making him up. So that this is his idea. You create this sovereign, you concede to it all authority, and you accept its law no matter what, because in return it will give you peace. And if it treats you unjustly, that's too bad. Because you see, prior to the establishment of this sovereign, there is no basis for law. And where there is no law, there's no injustice. So prior to establishing the Leviathan, prior to establishing a government, there's no injustice. If your neighbor lops off your head, there's no injustice because there's no law to be violated. You need a king, you need a sovereign, you need an assembly, you need a parliament, you need some kind of a senate to enact laws, and then if you violate those laws, then that's unjust. You might ask, well, what if the king or the sovereign abuses his authority? Well, as far as you're concerned, that's too bad. He has to answer to God for what he does, or the assembly has to answer to God for what it does. But as far as you're concerned, your obligation is simply to obey.
So he has no check?
No, there's no check on him. So the state, in other words, is a completely artificial entity. It's an artifice of man, created, emerging from the natural belligerent condition of competitive bodies in motion, which are people. That's a natural state of belligerency. People seeking peace, seeking to stay alive, create the state in order basically to control them so that they don't kill each other, except by authority of the state. And if the state then decides to kill you, too bad. But at least you have some kind of order. You have to give the sovereign, in order to have peace in this hostile state of affairs that exists between men, you have to give the sovereign absolute authority over the community so as to eliminate any possibility of dissension and hence civil war. See, he was really impacted by that English Civil War. He personally witnessed the confrontation between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. And I guess he would say martial law does have its advantages. But this is the basis of contract theory. It's based on the will. It's based on the will. John Locke now comes a wee bit later, and you'll feel a lot more comfortable with John Locke than you will with Hobbes. Hobbes obviously sounds a little bit rough at the edges, but Locke is much more of a gentleman. He was born in 1632, so that was about 40, 50 years after Hobbes. He died in 1704, which again would be about 25 years after Hobbes. John Locke is known as the father of classical liberalism. Now, not liberalism the way that we talk about it today, which is probably in a more pejorative sense, but in the sense of, and I know we don't think so much of this anymore, but the sense of the kind of limited government upon which the United States was formed and founded. He conceived of a government in which you would have a constitution, in which you would have rights, in which you would have freedom and recognition of individual rights. From Hobbes' standpoint, once you created this Leviathan, this absolute sovereign, all power resided in it. There was no separation of powers between the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. There was no separation between church and state. All power resided in the sovereign, whatever the sovereign wanted. And of course, as far as separation of church and state, remember too, in England at that time, there wasn't separation of church and state. So Locke comes along, and he is much more civil in what he proposes. He says that people are rational and tolerant, and that what we do, but he does realize they tend to be a bit selfish. So what we do is we form a state in order to try to have civil law that will protect the rights of everybody. He's not suggesting, as Hobbes did, that we'd naturally want to kill everybody, but indeed he does recognize that it's a good thing for men to join together, enter into a contract in which they create a limited form of sovereignty, one which is indirectly responsible to the people through some kind of representative government. He did not favor direct democracy. And in fact, you may notice that what I'm describing sounds a lot like the United States, doesn't it? Because Locke had a profound impact on Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers in terms of suggesting the creation of a limited form of government with distinction between the various branches of power. As you know, the concept of a kind of balances between these branches, separation of church and state, not the way that we have it today, I'm sure, but in its original conception, that you did not have a state government that was the erection of a particular church. So he would oppose having a government that would be completely Catholic or completely Anglican or completely Presbyterian, that would be the official government church, but rather you would have freedom for various religions to compete with each other within society. So yes, he had a tremendous impact on even the writing of the Declaration of Independence, because we're all familiar with the line about having certain unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's practically taken verbatim out of John Locke. The only difference is that in Locke it was the right to life, health, liberty, and the possession of property. Jefferson took out property and substituted happiness. But this is right out of Locke. Locke developed a labor theory of property, which he said basically things do not really have value until men have made use of them. So it's because we perfect, for example, you go out and take some land and you grow wheat on it, but the process of your labor going into the production of the wheat gives you the right to have the harvesting of that property, harvesting of the crop, which means you have to have governance of the property, which means you have the right of property. So from this he generates the right of private property. He also says that you should possess enough property to sustain yourself, and that arises the question of, well, what if you're making so much wheat you can't eat it all? Well, then he would allow that you could barter with others. I'll give you some corn, or I'll give you some wheat if you give me a few cows. But at the same time, he said that it's not really a natural thing. If you make more than you can keep and it would go to spoilage, that would be against nature. So he would allow that what you can do is barter with others so that everybody gets what he needs. And if you're dealing with more durable things, you can stock, for example, I suppose you could take a bunch of sheep and keep them because they don't die right away, keep feeding them and use them to trade for some cows at a later date. And from this, he even expanded it to the notion of money, that you could have assets that are durable other than the things that you actually consume or use, and therefore you could have gold and silver because it doesn't do anybody any harm, and you can use that as money to store wealth and value and property. And this too, again, you need some kind of a contract theory of government in order to protect people's property. So this flows from the notion of people being reasonable and tolerant of one another and trying to create circumstances in which life will be good by the establishment of a reasonable government. Sister?
I know we came in late, but what about the fact that before these days, there was government, there were kings, there was actual government,
Yeah.
because it was religious though, it wasn't a political necessarily, well.
Well, it wasn't always religious, but the point is, this, what they're trying to do is to enumerate a theory of government. This is, you know, yes, of course we have governments. We've had all kinds of forms of governments in the past, but they're trying to...
Kings, judges, all of that kind of
Right,
stuff.
but they're enumerating a theory of government in this in this way. And I think what they would argue is that in the past people had a social contract of some type, and that's how you got your kings and your judges and your emperors and so forth.
So they were just elaborating on what people were already doing?
Well, the difference, though, is that this began to be enacted in terms of politicians and
It was kind of prescriptive law, right?
yeah, you were then able to introduce this as the theory of government and the basis upon which, for example, it would be right to rebel against abuses. In fact, this notion of abuse of authority was picked up by the American rebels and even put into their own documents, and that was picked up right out of John Locke. So John Locke had a tremendous influence upon the founding of this country, the United States, and the formation of civil society. Also, Locke also did a lot of work in terms of epistemology and the theory of the self. He introduced the modern concept of the self as being not so much a substance or a soul, but a stream of, I don't want to use the word stream, that's the wrong context, but a sense of consciousness. A person, for him, is not a substantial entity as much as it is a being, a thing that is self-aware, that is self-conscious, can reflect upon itself, is aware of its own conscious past. And this is the modern notion of the person that has been brought even to the present. And they got into all kinds of interesting arguments about what happens if your memories get put into a different body somehow. Are you the body or are you the memories? And you get into all kinds of fascinating theories here, because of course what they're actually dealing with is the notion of person at the accidental level, because your consciousness is not yourself, but they view it as if it were yourself. And that's the modern concept of the person, which he helped, or he profoundly introduced. But, and of course, after Locke, we had Jean-Jacques Rousseau, somewhat later in the French period, who also espoused a social contract theory. So between Rousseau and Locke, you had the notion, by the time you come to the founding of the United States, that people have a right to get together and to form a more perfect union according to their common consent, and that they have the right to do this. Now you might ask, well, how does that differ from what natural law would say? And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. In the first place, when you talk about a social contract, you're viewing society as if it were some kind of an artificial unit. Now, one of the things you notice about natural law theory is that everything ultimately comes from God. God creates human nature. God creates the family. The family is a natural social institution. We don't make it up. We don't create it. We're trying to recreate it today. People are trying to malform and deform and pervert it every which way to Sunday. But in so doing, they are working on something that was established as a natural institution as far back as you can go in human history, or prehistory, if there be such. I have a friend who points out there isn't such a thing as prehistory because first thing that Genesis says that it is in the beginning God created man and woman. So there isn't any prehistory. That's where the beginning is, and it's recorded in Genesis. You know, the idea of prehistory is something happening before it was recorded. Well, that was the beginning, so there is no prehistory. But apparently people forgot how to read and write or something. But the whole point is that the family is a natural institution. And from the standpoint of natural law, society is a natural institution. You'll never find where you get a group of families together in a tribe where there isn't somebody who's in charge. As a matter of fact, one big difference with the social contract theory is, okay, we have people running around killing each other. We don't have to do anything about it. If you're willing to live in that state of nature and constantly defend yourself like a survivalist out in the wilderness, as long as you got enough guns, you don't need to form a society. There's no obligation to do it. Natural law says, wait a minute, there is an obligation. We have an obligation where men gather together to form a society. This flows from the intellective nature of man. We communicate by nature. We have obligations to each other by nature. We don't have the right. As Hobbes would suggest, you have the right to take anything you're strong enough to take. No, you don't have the right to do that. You have to recognize the value of other people. You don't have a right to kill them, to commit homicide, or to steal their property. There's no right to do that. And therefore you have an obligation not only to respect their property, but where many men gather together, an obligation to protect each other's property and natural rights. Now, mind you, some of the things that came over into the founding documents of the United States recognize the very thing I just mentioned, because we say we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So there isn't a total tension between social contract theory and natural law theory. The one thing you see in John Locke is he's got a lot of common sense. He tends to come down on the side of a very reasonable solution to things, unlike Hobbes. So that it really becomes a matter of cutting fine edges to sometimes find where the difference would be. It may be just a difference in the theoretical structure that you say you're applying, because in practice, what you find in the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution is, as far as I know, compatible either with a kind of social contract theory or a natural law theory. I'm not an expert on this. I don't want to push it. I do think, though, if you focus on the Declaration of Independence, you get more of a concept that you see God behind this and establishing rights and men joining together to protect those rights. And that is closer to a natural law expression. So society, from the standpoint of contract theory, is an artifice. It's an artificial thing. It's not a natural thing. From the standpoint of natural law, it is the next logical step after the family. It is a natural institution because we are obliged to form it. In social contract theory, you're not obliged to form it. You could just sit there forever with no law, no justice, and defending your territory with a sawed-off shotgun. And you wouldn't be doing anything right or wrong. Hobbes would say there really isn't any right or wrong until you have a sovereign, until you've got a Leviathan. Then there is law, and then there can be injustice and right or wrong and criminal behavior. Social contract theory gives you rights, but the rights come from the contract. That again is where you see the Declaration of Independence doesn't say that, does it? It says that we get these rights from God. Natural law says we get the rights from God. More than that, natural law would say the rights are not limited by contract, by the contract itself. Now, you notice in the American Constitution we have certain enumerated rights, don't we? In the Bill of Rights, we have certain enumerated rights. But then we also have what are called unenumerated rights, which means that we are open to a recognition that there are other rights. If they are rights in the same sense as the Declaration of Independence, then they come from God, in which case it is the function of civil society to discover and manifest these rights, not to create them. Of course, obviously, that's where we're getting into a bit of trouble today, aren't we? Because we are creating rights that never existed and ought not exist, and in fact do not exist according to natural law. The authority of government in contract theory is directly from the will of the people forming the contract. Whereas in natural law theory, the authority of the government comes from God immediately. It is indirectly expressed by the will of the people forming some type of government. You say, what kind of government? It doesn't have to be democracy. No, it doesn't. It can be anything that works. If you want to have a king, go ahead. If you want to have an emperor, go ahead. If you want to have representative democracy or a republic, as we have in this country, go ahead. If you want to have a pure democracy, well, go ahead, but it doesn't work too well. You know, like they, in theory, have in Switzerland. According to Rousseau, authority, once given to the government, can be given and can be recalled immediately, because he was saying it floated on the will of the people, and what you had was pure democracy. Pure democracy means that on every issue, everybody gets together and decides what's to do. Well, I guess you could do that in a tribe, you know, a very small group of people. And he was thinking particularly of Geneva, Switzerland, which of course was just a city, and you could have a town hall meeting every night, I suppose, if you wanted to. But that's not really very possible in a genuine state, a nation of any size. And besides that, you need to have stability within a government. And there is no stability. See, according to Rousseau, what you really have is you have the people running the entire government, and the so-called government is just a bunch of clerks who can be appointed and removed in 5 minutes. Obviously, that doesn't work too well, and it also doesn't give you stability of law, because you can change the law every 2 minutes as well. All you got to do is get everybody together and we change the law. Okay, if you can't kill anybody today, well, tomorrow it's going to be okay. Now, of course, you can do these things with a representative democracy or a republic, but it takes a lot longer. You have stability of laws. You have the ability to establish a constitution. That's another thing that natural law would provide for if you wish to do it. Doesn't have to be a written constitution. You could have a largely unwritten constitution. You could have, as the English system of common law has, simply case precedent, basically, in the Magna Carta. But that establishes a kind of stability over time. It doesn't always have to be written down into the Constitution like we do in the United States, or as you do in Canada. And of course, what the Canadians do, they just remade their Constitution. They got a new Constitution. The people can do this if they want to. But of course, remember, as we noted earlier on, that doesn't mean you can enact any law you want, because the positive laws that are enacted must be conformable to natural law. So you cannot pass a law that renders something intrinsically immoral to be mandated, such as taxing people and forcing their tax dollars to be used to pay for abortions. In natural law theory, once the authority is given, it must be followed. However you've established a government, until and unless the government becomes totally unable to function, or unable even to protect its citizens. I mean, now there would come a point, for example, during the English Civil War, there got to a point, like I think it was around 1649, where the loyalists couldn't govern anymore because they were losing too many battles, they were losing too much land. Well, there comes a point where if the sovereign cannot protect and enforce the legislation, effectively the government ceases to be. If you have an entire society where this happens, then what happens is people have an obligation to restructure the government and get another government. But you can't willy-nilly just say, well, I don't like my government, so I'm not going to be part of it. The government functions with the consent of the people. You might say, well, I was just born here. I didn't consent. It's not my idea, whatever they're doing. But of course, you see, you are consenting. You're not leaving, are you? If you're living here and not emigrating and not staging armed rebellion, well, I guess you're consenting. So the fact that, for example, the United States was founded some 200 years ago, you can't say, well, what they did then doesn't bind us now. The fact is we're still living under the same regime that was established at that time, and therefore we cannot arbitrarily, dissent and leave on our own. We have to try to make it work and try to make it function according to natural law. But until it ceased to function, until you, for example, had complete chaos replacing it, you would not have the right to just overturn it automatically. On the other hand, most of the social contract people, and of course, natural law theory would also say that if the government is acting intrinsically immoral from the top down, you would have the right to depart from it. This very issue arose, actually, as a matter of theory and argument during World War II, when they were trying to decide what to do with Hitler. If you were in Germany when Hitler was the dictator, did you have an obligation to serve him in every way? The question arose, could you depose him? Could you assassinate him? And as a matter of fact, as you know, they tried to do it in 1944, and the ringleaders of the assassination plot, I understand, were Catholics. So we could get there. Again, following John Locke, a lot of common sense helps here. Sister?
I have a question about Sharia law, and you said people who live here have to say they give consent. Did you say that?
No, I'm saying they are giving consent by living here.
Okay, so now we have
That's different.
the Muslims who are arriving here in great numbers who want to establish Sharia law, which is in many ways opposite to our laws. Now, what about that?
You can't do it. I mean, if they're crazy enough to let them do it, God help us. But you can't do it. We have our system of laws. The laws that are on the books in the United States are the laws of the United States. There aren't any other sets of laws. You come in with your little Boy Scout rules that you want to replace them with, you can't do it.
Why do you think that they don't just say that outright, the
Well,
government?
I understand the reason is that it's kind of crept in a few places where they're dealing like with estates, and they're trying to determine the proper sequence, say, of bequests, and to do that, they try to get the mind of the people who are leaving the money, let's say, or the people who've entered into some kind of a marriage contract or whatever it be, and to get into their mind, they therefore go back into their traditions, which include Sharia. See? So it kind of sneaks in. Well, I think one judge down in Florida brought it in and nearly got himself assassinated, and then he said, well, I didn't really mean it that way. It's a difference between consulting the law and replacing your law with their law. So there may be a legitimate reason that you might want to find out more about their tradition for some purpose of family or civil law. But that's not the same thing as replacing your law with their law. And I believe that one of the states
State just
just passed a law, was it Oklahoma or Kansas? Passed a law saying Sharia law has no binding force in this state and is not to be used by any judges, which is clear enough. And I think unless we want to commit national suicide, we'd better realize this pretty rapidly. There is no law but the law that is presently consented to, and that's the one that's on the books. You can't bring in your own law that, normally people that come to a country accept the law, they get integrated into the country, right? They become part of the citizenry of the country. The problem we've had lately is people have wanted to come to this country and then carry their own baggage and refuse to be assimilated and to refuse to become Americans. The point is, when you come to the United States of America, presumably you want to become an American, you want to learn the language of the country, which is English, and you want to adopt the customs and the laws of the country. You can keep your own traditional. I mean, this doesn't mean that the Polish people can't have their own festivities and traditions, but it means that in your public demeanor, you are expected to act as an American and to be aware of the values, the cultures, the traditions, the law, and the history of this country, and consent to it almost completely. Otherwise, why did you come here?
But it's not complete in the sense that, well, I wanted to ask this question too. When a person becomes a citizen, do they swear? Is there a swearing to abide by this government? I don't know what's involved in citizen things.
I'm sure you swear to uphold the Constitution and to do everything even the president would do.
But on the other hand, Muslims have killed in the name of religion because they're ashamed of their
Yeah,
kids.
but we have laws against homicide. Our laws have to trump. Sorry. Just because you belong to a sect that thinks, for example, that you could let yourself and your kids be bitten by snakes that are venomous, that doesn't mean you're allowed to do it. That case has been approached too. There's nothing new with that.
But to be politically correct all over the place, they're allowing a lot of stupid things like that.
Well, this is how you lose your society if you're not careful. That's why you have tradition. That's why everybody coming to the United States in the past wanted to assimilate. That doesn't mean you give up your heritage, but you're proud to become an American and to accept the Constitution. And yes, you do swear and affirm to that. And in fact, of course, if you become a Canadian, you swear and affirm to accept the Canadian Constitution and to give loyalty and recognition to the Queen, which raises some fascinating questions about what happens when Americans have dual citizenship or become Canadians, or Canadians become Americans but don't give up their citizenship as Canadians. After all, as Americans, what did we do? We fought against King George III, and we rebelled against him, and we proved our disloyalty to him. Now you have Americans with dual citizenship or acquiring dual citizenship with Canada, where they swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen. Now, I'm not trying to pick on anybody here. I know it's done in good faith, but good grief, it sounds a little bit contradictory. I know, because my own daughter did it. So there's a lot of good people do this. I don't think they look at what they're doing when they do it, and they swear themselves in. But the whole concept of having a nation is that you have some kind of integrity and consistency and legislation and sovereignty within that the governing body of your society, to which you are giving assent. With social contract theory, though, it's all based on the notion of the will. If you look on page 38 of your notes, section 18, political ethics, subsection A, 2, where we're talking about the origin, you notice, with Hobbes and Rousseau, possibly Locke, notice it's not clear, it comes from will. So it's the will of the people creating the government. From Aristotle and St. Thomas, natural law theory says it's a natural thing. When you have enough people to become needing self-governance and protection, you have an obligation to form a government. And in fact, people do this very naturally, even out in the wilderness. As soon as possible, you start forming villages. When they were taming the West, you form a village, and then pretty soon you have a county, and then you have a territory. And if you work it hard, it becomes a state. And all the way through, this is a natural process. And it's one that you have an obligation to engage in order to protect the rights of people, so you don't have Jesse James loose everywhere and nobody can stop him. But
So immigration laws that would restrict or set standards for people coming in are a natural act of a natural law
Society has a natural right and obligation to protect itself. Self-defense. Immigration laws are simply part of that self-defense. It's part of governance, it's partly self-defense, it's part of a way of growing your society by bringing new members in, but new members who will contribute, not new members who will be terrorists. Not new members who are bringing in a back seat full of heroin. So we have border patrols, we have customs agents, as well as immigration. So this notion of contract theory, in other words, is a very commonly held view, but it is a perversion of the actual way things ought to be. If you go back in history, Sister, you raised this question before, what about before Rousseau and before Hobbes? Well, you go back to the patriarchs of ancient Israel. What was this? You literally had people getting married, having children, and the children marrying and having children, and you formed a patriarchal tribe, which became a nation. And simply by common recognition of somebody being in charge of the whole thing by some way, it could be hereditary, and hence you'd have a king. But remember, they didn't have a king initially, did they?
They had to, they prayed for it. The Israelites prayed for a king. They prayed for judges, they prayed for prophets.
Yeah, and they got them.
Right,
They wanted to
but
be
they didn't
nations.
elect them. They didn't elect them, they were a natural.
And it doesn't matter how they get them, as long as it's the consent of the people. That's the thing that's kind of surprising. The form of the government is up to the people. It is natural to have a government. And the government has certain powers. Before we run out of time, I want to point out something indicating the natural state of the government arises from the fact that the government can bind your conscience with law. It can do that. It has the right, as we've already demonstrated, ultimately, even to take your life through capital punishment. As an individual, I can't do that. As an individual, I can't bind your conscience. So there are certain properties that are found in a government that transcend the authority of an individual person. The authority which ultimately could only come from something transcendent to the individual man or to man himself. In other words, from God. That which could have authority over life and conscience would actually have to come from God, not from individual human beings. So that although government is formed through the will of the people, determining its form determining who governs. It is not formed by the will of the people that there should be a government. That comes from God. God is the immediate author of the family and of government. But again, just as within the family, you can naturally direct yourself as to where you live and what you do in general, but you can't violate God's law. You can't violate natural law. There's limitations there. It's a kind of self-governance that the family has. That's natural and good and proper. So too, when you have a number of actually families gathered together, because that is the basic building block of society, you reach a point at which it is necessary to have civil society, a civil government, which again operates according to the will of the people, but the will of the people in accordance with natural law, and ultimately deriving its authority from God, conferring to that government the powers which we as individuals would not have. But you have to have them. You have to have the ability, for example, to form an army in order to defend society. So if you look up at the top of page 39, let's just begin this tonight. The nature of civil society according to natural law is, like all other things in natural law, you have form and you have matter, a hylomorphic union. Form is the bond of citizenship, which would be what we've been talking about. The structure of government, the Constitution, the rules, the laws, whatever you have, that you have bound yourself to by being part of this society. The matter are the people who are within that society. The end of the form and matter operating together is the common good, the good of everybody in society. But notice under the matter is family, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because the natural institution is the family. Individuals, if they never engaged in sexual congress, that's a better kind of congress than the one we have in Washington, by forming a family unit, you'd never have the building blocks for society. In other words, if you had a whole bunch of individuals who never got married, you would not really have a natural basis for society. They'd have to have some kind of society, assuredly, but that is not the way God intended it to operate, because society needs to replace itself. The natural means by which it does it is through sexual congress within the marital bond, within marriage. So you have individual family units joining together to be the matter out of which a society is formed, binding itself together according to laws under some form of governance for the common good. Now, what is that common good? We're just running out of time here, but I want you to notice something about this common good. Common good are things like peace and justice. Well, after all, isn't that what Hobbes was looking for? He wanted peace. He didn't want you to be having your neighbor hit you over the head all the time. He wanted justice.
He wanted the absence of belligerence.
He wanted the absence of belligerence. Hopefully the peace you find in a proper civil society is more noble than just the absence of belligerence. You want order. You want freedom. Not freedom in the sense of license, not the freedom to do just anything, but the freedom to do what is right, which is a proper understanding of freedom. Well-informed public opinion. Notice that these are not things. They're not physical things. They're not things that you can take out and look at. I mean, one of the things that we have here that isn't listed as such is civic friendship. That's what allowed you to come here tonight and leave your guns at home. I mean, really, isn't it nice we can walk in here with the realization and the hope that we will be amicable and we'll walk out without killing each other? It doesn't always work that way, especially in taverns. But civic friendship is an essential ingredient of a good society. In the Old West, everybody had to have his own gun, didn't he? And I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not for gun control. But what I'm saying is when you have an absence of law, it is more necessary for individuals to take the law into their own hands in terms of protecting themselves. But where you have law well established in a well-regulated society where people have learned to control themselves by rational obedience to commonly accepted laws, it becomes less and less necessary to study martial arts, where the old and the disabled and the indigent and the hungry and the weak and the young can go about in safety and peace and happiness with their fellow man. That's civic friendship, one of the common goods that is attained by the establishment of society operating according to natural law. You can't see it, but thank God we have it. It's the reason we can just calmly come together once a week and have a class. And thus far, none of us have killed anybody else. May it continue for another week. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.